for true detectives, Alexander McCall Smith, will talk about sleuths in Gaborone and Edinburgh in a conversation with Nandini Krishnan.
Are we ready to go? Good to go? Okay, I'm guessing so. You can probably hear my heartbeat right now louder than my voice. I have to confess that I'm honored and thrilled and terrified to be doing this session. This gentleman has written over 80 books, and each one is so exquisite that one doesn't really know where to begin. And I mean, and I don't think we can restrict this session to just detectives, because you've spoken of the consequences of gender parity among sniffer dogs, the benefits literary agents reap from posthumously popular authors, and you've come up with insights as precious as, I'm going to read this out, people who received pianos as gifts always have something to hide. I don't think anyone knew that. So I don't think an hour today and the session we have tomorrow can quite encapsulate Mr. Alexander McCall Smith's work. And worst of all, I think he's far more than the sum of his work. I know that he has strong political convictions, so with your permission and with yours, I'd like to take the scope of this session a little beyond his characters into the writer himself.
Well, yes, that's a little bit intimidating too. I normally don't like to discuss politics, but I don't want to spoil all your questions. But I must say also it's very nice to have a microphone that works. In my experience, microphones don't work. They're all produced in a single factory where there's a table at the end called quality control, and they give the microphone a good hit before it goes out, so it fails when you use it. And I had a wonderful, with these microphones, you have to be terribly careful, because you've got to be careful what you say, because you don't know if they're active or not, when they're pinned onto you, and you can forget that you've got a microphone. I had an experience once of that nature with William Dalrymple, whose works you will know. He'll be well known to our audience today. And Willie Dalrymple and I were in Edinburgh doing an event rather like this. And we were backstage, and Willie said to me, before we went on, he said, how old are your readers? And I said, well, a range. I have some very young readers and some readers who aren't so young. And he said, mine are all ancient. And that's the point at which I saw the officials running through the corridor towards us. And we were transmitting into the hall. And he was very embarrassed, and I said, look, Willie, don't worry. If your readers are all that old, they won't have heard what you said. So these mics so far are working, which is very nice.
We probably have an equivalent of Mr. Matakoni seeing to the mics, do we?
To the mics, yes, I would thought so, because Mr. J.L.B. Matakoni in the #1 Ladies Detective Agency is a tremendously competent man when it comes to machinery, and he'd certainly be able to deal with mics. He's got a very sensitive touch. His apprentices don't. They use a hammer. That's their main tool.
So they were probably in charge in the Edinburgh Festival.
They probably were, yes.
So before we go on to the detectives in Gaborone and Edinburgh, I'm going to open with a question which brings them together, not the detectives, but the cities. And we aren't starting with the #1 Ladies Detective Agency, but the #1 Ladies Opera House, which I think was the site of the Scotsman's ultimate revenge on Shakespeare for everything he did to discredit your country. Where you had Macbeth starring baboons.
Yes, that's right. We set up a little opera house. To call it an opera house is a bit of an exaggeration. I think it was, in fact, originally a garage. And it was converted into a little opera house which seated 50 people. So tiny little thing. And the idea was to create something that would give great pleasure to people who are very interested in singing. In Botswana, as in many African countries, singing is part of the of ordinary life. People sing as they do their work, as they walk around. People learn how to sing when they're very small. Their grannies will sing to them, and so on. And so singing is deep in the culture. And I wanted to do something to help with that. And so we set up this little opera house. And our first opera that we did was a result of a visit that I had paid to the Okavango Delta up in the north of the country, where the Okavango River, being misadvised, goes in the wrong direction, and it flows away from the sea, which rivers usually don't. I mean, usually rivers go towards the sea, except when they're very misinformed. And this river goes back into the Kalahari. Anyway, it's a lovely delta, and I was there with my American agent and my American editor, and we were going along on the river in this boat with a very competent guide. We had a very good guide. And suddenly I saw these little buildings in the trees in the jungly bit along the side of the water. And I said, who's that? And the guide said, oh no, that's the baboon people. We mustn't go and disturb them. And then the penny dropped with me. And I had read recently, I'm quite interested in a very amateurish way in primatology, and I'd read a book called Baboon Metaphysics, which was by two American primatologists, and it was all about how baboons have a concept of the other mind. And I realized this was their research camp. And these people had spent 10 years studying the baboons, this troop of baboons. They knew all their names, and the baboons probably knew them as well. And so I said, well, let's go and see them. And so we went to see them, and we had a wonderful welcome. And I then suddenly had the idea, because they had said, they talked about status issues in baboon society. I realized that baboons have Lady Macbeth issues, because Lady Macbeth is very ambitious for her husband, as you'll recall the story. She eggs him on. You know, he's a fairly domestic sort of, he's a bit of a new man. He's a new Scotsman. And he's not very ambitious, but she wants him to go off and murder the king, which is her sort of social ambition. And he does it. And so we set the story of Macbeth in the opera in a troupe of baboons. And so it's the first opera, A, set in Botswana, and B, set amongst a troupe of baboons in the world. And so we did that. And we did various other things in the little opera house, and it lasted for 5 years, but eventually we decided that it was just too expensive to keep going, and so we closed it down. But we had five good years of interesting things happening there.
I watched a few clippings from the libretto, and the singing is out of the world, and I was wondering, in terms of the setting, in terms of the jungle life that is portrayed, this came out a few years after The Lion King became a big hit on Broadway and on the West End. So were you worried that people might confuse the two, or?
Well, I don't think there was any danger of that. We were a smaller production than The Lion King, but no, I think people would have seen it in a different way. I must say I really enjoyed doing it, because I like working with musicians. I mean, I was very interested to see this previous session here, where that was a lovely example of a writer working with musicians. I enjoy writing song cycles. I'm working on another operatic libretto at the moment, and I do enjoy it, because writing can be quite a lonely activity. It's just you sitting there writing the book, and you don't really communicate very much about it until the book goes out and people, you hope, read it. And then you may interact with people at that stage. So that's the point at which people will write to you about your book, and they love to write to you to point out your mistakes. That's a favorite activity. Years after publication, you'll get a letter saying you said such and such, and this is not true, and you write back and thank them for their close attention. Because authors do make mistakes in their books, you see. Authors make mistakes left, right, and centre, and I've made many mistakes in my books, which I wasn't proposing to list today, but none of them quite as bad as one mistake made by an American novelist who on page 1 describes one of the characters as unfortunately only having one arm, and on page 142 the same character claps his hands together. Now, that, I blame the editor. I'd say that that's an editorial problem. Because editors should realize that writers don't have a sufficiently long concentration spell to remember how many limbs their characters have. And
So I'm going to play devil's advocate. The #1 ladies detective agency has sold over 30 million copies, and I believe it took Michael Jackson about 30 years to sell that many LPs of Thriller in the United States. So you've beaten him there. It's been translated into 46 languages, where again, hopefully you've beaten Thriller. So clearly you owe a lot to Precious Ramotswe. But every interview that I've read of yours or heard, you always have to tell the interviewer, look, I have written other books, so can we talk about those, please? So, do you have mixed feelings for Ma Ramotswe?
well, that's a very interesting question. And no, I don't have mixed feelings. I'm very pleased that Ma Ramotswe has achieved a wide audience, because I think that's what authors like to do. They like to be read. I mean, if you ask authors whether they would like people to read their books, the usual answer is yes. I mean, there may be unusual authors who say no. I don't.
I made a mistake with a number of limbs, so leave this book out.
Oh, well, that's a problem. You see, you can't, once you've published a book, you can't withdraw it. That's the difficulty, because the book is out there. And one of the things that I do is that I write a serial novel called the Scotland Street series, and I've written 10 of those books so far. In fact, I'm just writing volume 11 at the moment. But that is published chapter by chapter in the newspaper, in the Scotsman newspaper, as I write it. So I write a chapter and it goes off to the newspaper and they publish it that day. I do it a chapter a day for a period of about 3 months each year. Now, the problem with that is that it's then published before you've finished the manuscript. And this is unusual. I mean, usually authors finish their manuscripts, then they're published. But in this case, you've already published these chapters. And so what do you do if you get fed up with one of the characters, as writers do? Now, normally you could go and edit the script before it goes to the publishers, and you could just clean it up and get rid of a character. But once you've published that, you can't. So what happens there is that some of the characters just disappear. And somebody says, where's so-and-so? No, haven't seen them. And that's it. And that happens in soap operas on television as well, where what they do is the characters get washed out to sea. That's the usual way of disposing of a character. Where's so-and-so? Washed out to sea. And that enables them to return when if the actor's been ill, he gets washed out to sea for 6 months, then he comes back. Oh, he's washed back in. So it is... and so being washed out to sea is a major hazard for characters in soap operas, as is loss of memory. They suffer from loss of memory all the time. It's endemic. It's as common as the common cold in soap operas.
You're preaching to the choir here. We've grown up watching movies like this,
yes.
where people get washed out to sea and the twins come back, or
Yes.
someone gets hit on the head and they get hit on the head again and the memory is back.
Oh, it's terrific. I've used it myself. I had one of my characters hit on the head by a coconut. And that was great because it changed her character altogether. She was really horrible. And she was hit on the head by a coconut and became quite nice. But then her friends felt, where's our old friend gone? So she's hit on the head by another coconut and goes back to the original character. Because people do that's good plotting in my view.
I think if there are any Bollywood directors here, you might find them approaching you with with contracts, not books.
Oh, they've done all this. They know all this. They've done it before.
Right. I'm glad you brought up 44 Scotland Street, because in a recent interview you said that if you were to meet one of your characters, you would choose Bertie, the 7-year-old Bertie, and you want to tell him that life does get better. His mother will at some point be less important.
Yes, Bertie, I feel so sorry for Bertie. He's one of my favourite characters. Bertie is in my Scotland Street novels, and Bertie's problem is his mother. And that's a difficulty for many small boys. If you interviewed small boys boys, and you'd say, what are your problems? Well, firstly, they'll look over their shoulder, and if they realize they're by themselves, they'll say, my mother. That really is the problem because it goes back to baboons, you see. You know, they're ambitious. Mothers are ambitious for their sons. And so Bertie's got this really dreadful mother called Irene, who is really ambitious for Bertie. He's only 7. In fact, he's 6 at the beginning of the series. And then 8 years later, he's still 6. He doesn't quite, chronologically, it's not quite right. It's a mistake on my part. But anyway, he continues to be this 7-year-old boy. Eventually, I give him a 7th birthday. But here's this little boy with this mother, Irene, who makes him, although he's only at the beginning of the book 6, she makes him learn Italian so he can appreciate Italian culture. She makes him learn the saxophone. He does a very good rendition of As Time Goes By from Casablanca, although in his case it doesn't. And then he goes to yoga classes called Yoga for Tots, where the children are so small they can't even sit up and they have to be pushed into the yoga positions by their pushy mothers. And he has psychotherapy. He goes to psychotherapy with Dr. Hugo Fairbairn, author of that classic of child psychotherapy, Shattered to Pieces, Ego Dissolution in a 3-year-old Tyrant. And poor little Bertie, all he really wants to be is to be an ordinary little boy doing the things that ordinary little boys want. And that's the problem with these little boys. They aren't allowed to do the things that little boys want to do, which was to run around and have a Swiss Army penknife is a very major ambition of little boys. And Bertie doesn't have that. He goes to an advanced kindergarten, doesn't go to an ordinary kindergarten, goes to an advanced kindergarten. And while he's in his advanced kindergarten, his mother, Irene, goes to a floatarium where she floats in one of these flotation chambers to de-stress. And she's in her flotation chamber one day, and her cell phone goes, and it's the headmistress of the advanced kindergarten who says, would you kindly come up to the advanced kindergarten? There has been an incident. And so she gets out of her flotation chamber, goes up to the advanced kindergarten to be greeted by a hatchet-faced Miss Macpherson, who's the principal. And she says, one of the children has written graffiti on the toilet wall. And Irene bristles and says, well, why do you look at me? Why do you think it's my Bertie? And Miss Macpherson, the principal, says, because he's the only one who can write. And then she adds, and it's in Italian.
Oh, right.
Poor little Bertie, I don't know what we can do with him. I mean, if anybody's got any ideas about how we can save him from his mother. Every so often I get his mother taken away for a while, which gives him a little glimpse of freedom. So there was an occasion where she goes off to... she enters a competition to find a new slogan for Emirates Airlines, and she wins 5 days in Dubai. And Bertie's terribly pleased, because he can now eat pizza and do all sorts of things that he can't. And she's there for about 5 months, because she's mistaken for the new wife of a Bedouin sheikh. And she ends up in a harem in the desert. And the British Sergeant tries to get her released, but the sheikh is having nothing to do with this, because he's been having a bit of trouble with the harem recently, and she's settled it down because she's formed a book group.
Maybe she should have another brood of kids to torment, and then we can leave Bertie to his devices.
We must do something for him. He Swiss Army penknife, I did give him a 7th birthday, and I thought he was really hoping for a Swiss Army penknife for his birthday, but no, he gets a box which he opens, and he gets 2 gifts from his mother. One is a gender-neutral play figure, in other words, a doll, and the other one is a box all wrapped up. He opens it up, and it's a junior UN peacekeeping kit. Whereas he just wants a Swiss Army penknife. And he does actually, once he meets another little boy who leads a real little boy's life, little boy called Andy, and Andy shows him his collection of Swiss Army penknives, and Bertie's little heart fills with joy at the sight of these. Andy takes one of these penknives and says, this, Bertie, is a Swiss Army penknife. the Swiss army fights only with penknives. And Bert says, well... So you see, it's social realism, I write.
Right. Well, you do have a lot of dominant mothers and very cool fathers. Have some people, not I, but some people may accuse you of sexism, whatever you say about sniffer dogs.
Well, no, actually, you know, the female characters in my books, if you take the number one ladies detective agency, the ladies are the heroines there, definitely. They've got, I mean, Mr. J.L.B. Matacone, the garage mechanic, is a nice man. He's a very decent man, but he's a bit indecisive. Whereas Mara Matsui represents all the fine female virtues, and Mama Kutsi has also got a great deal to be said for her. So they are the main characters, and indeed in my Isabel Dalhousie series, which is another series of books which I write set in Edinburgh, there Isabel is very much the heroine, the driving force. I mean, people sometimes say to me, well, why? I mean, you said it very politely. But you know, why do you write about these women? And I think it's accident actually that I started that I started to do this. And I think also it's more interesting. I find as a writer the conversation of women is very interesting. Women talk about interesting things. I'm not saying that men don't occasionally, but. But if you listen to what a group of men are talking about, it's quite different from what a group of women will be talking about. The difficulty, of course, as a writer, as a male writer, is trying to get it right, is trying to find out what women are talking about. Because if you approach, they stop. And so you can't really tell. I do like listening to conversations. I find that fascinating. It's very frustrating these days with people speaking on their cell phones because you only hear one side. So you therefore have to try to imagine what's being said at the other end. But seriously, going to this reason of why, for example, in the Botswana books in the number one ladies detective agency, I have these two main women characters, is because the conversation, if those were two men sitting in that little office in Gaborone, the conversation would be different. And it wouldn't have the flavor that it does with Mara Matsui and Mama Kutsi. It is different.
They probably come off a little bit like Mr. J.L.B. Matukone's assistants, talking about girls and the go-go men's bar.
Oh, yes. Well, those two young men, the two apprentices, Charlie and Fanwell, I don't know what to do with them because you're quite right. One of them just all he talks about is girls. That's what he thinks about as girls. The other one's a little bit better. Fanwell's a little bit better. But actually, they've been apprentices for a long time because those books have been going since 1998, and they're still apprentices. And somebody said to me the other day, look, how long does it take to do an apprenticeship in Botswana? And I said 20, 25 volumes.
You've spoken about breaking the rules in terms of numbers of words that you write per day, per hour. But, most authors tend to have autobiographical elements in their first book. And when I look at you, I don't immediately think Botswana black woman detective. So I was just curious about what your agents and what your publishers thought when you have a professor of medical law writing about a detective agency headed by this Botswana lady.
Well, yes. I mean, I think people also do point out to me that perhaps I'm a somewhat unlikely candidate for writing that particular series of books. But I think it's very important that as a writer, you should be able to actually understand the reality of all sorts of people, not just people who are just like yourself, who've had the same historical experience, personal experience, as you yourself have had, but also people whose experience of the world is very different. So I don't think that there's much of an issue there, because I think that you have to make the imaginative leap into the shoes of others. And that's what I think being an author is all about, is developing that ability to see the world through a different set of eyes. So I don't find that too much of of an issue. As to the autobiographical element, I think you're right in a sense that if you look at the work of any author, you will find issues there that reflect the personal concerns of the writer. It would be very odd if that weren't the case. It's said that authors give themselves away every third sentence. In fact, I think it's more often than that. I think every sentence authors can give themselves away. So I certainly put in issues that I'm interested in, and if you look at my books, you can more or less work out where I've been by seeing what's mentioned in the books, in the Scotland Street books in particular, because this is a serial novel which goes on and on. You can actually see where I've been traveling. So there's one of the books where suddenly the action shifts to Cuba. And there's no reason to shift to Cuba other than that I'd just been in Cuba and sort of brought it up that way. So I think that you can do that. And I find I also agree with some of my characters. I'm in total agreement with Mara Matsui. It's quite extraordinary, actually. Virtually everything she says, I agree with. And Isabel Dalhousie, I'm in complete agreement with. So I'm really in agreement with most of my characters. I don't do villains very well. I don't do characters I don't like very much. I occasionally will have somebody who's the baddie, but not very often. And of course the Mara Matsui books, the #1 ladies detective agency books, are sometimes described as crime. They aren't, actually. Nothing nasty happens in my books, and we don't get any violence. Somebody said to me once, you should have a car chase in your books, because these detective stories, you should have a car chase. And I said, no, my readers are far too nervous for that sort of thing. So I compromised, and I had a chase involving supermarket trolleys, and they went, which was quite enough excitement for my readers, and I thought of putting little asterisks in the margin to advise the more nervous readers that at this point they could skip several pages too.
So, but you spoke of how you could relate to Mara Matsui, but you also spent a long time in Africa. You grew up in Zimbabwe,
Yes.
You spent time in Botswana. But you were also in Africa at a time of great turmoil. There was apartheid in South Africa, and then you had the crisis in Zimbabwe. And, but in the middle of all this, Botswana comes across as this oasis where everyone comes for pleasure, and which seems to have made remarkable progress. So that's clearly something that's very dear to you.
Yes, I think Botswana is a remarkable country in that if you look at Botswana's modern history, since independence in 1966, it was a protectorate before that. Since 1966, it's been consistently democratic, and they've observed the rule of law, whereas in many sub-Saharan African countries, that is not the case. I'm not blaming people for that, because I think that obviously Africa's 19th and 20th century history was very difficult. But I think that Botswana has really been a shining example of the benefits that come from adherence to the rule of law. So the Botswana government has always observed the decisions of the legal system of the courts. The constitution has always been observed, which I think is great. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't any problems, because it would be very unusual if there were a country which had no problems. But generally speaking, Botswana has had a very good history, and I think that they can be justifiably proud of what they've created, and they've created it through their own efforts. I mean, at the time of independence, there was something, I forget what the exact figures were, but I mean, there was something like 8 miles of tarred road and a couple of secondary schools, something like that it was. And they've done it themselves, brick by brick. They've built this very fine country. And the diamond revenues have been used to create a very good infrastructure. So they've got very good schools, hospitals, and so on. And so it's a remarkable story. And a lot of the initial credit must go to the first president Seretse Khama, who was a very fine man, and he set the moral tone of the country. And so there was very little, in fact, there was no tolerance of corruption, and there was comparatively little corruption. It's still not a corrupt country. I mean, there's a certain amount of corruption, but not as much as there is in certain other countries in the region. And so all of that is really very important. And Mara Matsui, Mara Matsui comes across as a very fine person, and people say to me, they accuse me of being a utopian writer. They say, you're looking at the world with rose-tinted spectacles. I'm not actually. I can point to people I've met in Botswana. I've met people like that. I've met a lot of people like that who are very proud of their country and who want to preserve those values. And I think it's very easy to be cynical. It's very easy just to take a bleak view of the world and say the world is a vale of tears, the world is an absolute disaster. It's very easy to look at sub-Saharan Africa and say this is a dreadful situation. Now, I'm not denying that there aren't substantial problems, that there's political pathology, economic pathology, all of that. I'm not denying that that exists, but I'm just saying there's another side to the story. And the other side to the story is a very positive one. And it's the story of people leading good lives, often in very difficult circumstances. And that's what Mara Matsui, I think, is about. And that's why I think she speaks to people in so many different countries and cultures, because she's a certain sort of human type representing a certain sort of human virtue, without being excessively virtuous, but nonetheless, I think she represents that.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the idea of rose-tinted spectacles, because your latest book, Emma, it is your latest. You haven't written any in the last 2 weeks or so with your rate of 4,000 words a day.
I've published 2 books since then.
Since Emma.
Sorry, you're more or less up to date. My almost latest.
Almost latest. So in Emma, there's this one part where Harriet Smith speaks about prime ministers, and I think she says something like, I thought you had to be awfully clever to be a prime minister. And Emma sort of scoffs in her head, like, what kind of silly statement is this? And I'm sure in democracies across the world, people will agree with Emma on what a silly statement that is. But I was wondering at this shift from Mara Matsui from 15 years ago to Emma now, do you think it's a product of the world that we live in, or the geography, or the characters themselves, or has your view shifted a little since then to kind of accommodate corruption and...
Well, that's a very interesting question. Has my view shifted? I suppose it would be very unusual if you asked anybody whether their views have changed and they said no change at all, because that would suggest that one's making no progress. Now, of course, also there's progress and there's decline. I think one's views can change and do change. I think we all experience that as we go through the world. You know, if we look at our 18-year-old selves or our 20-year-old selves, and then compare them with ourselves at 30, 40, 50, at the various milestones in this life, one certainly would find in general a change in understanding the world. You certainly should understand more about the world as you go through it. I don't think that my writing has changed a great deal, and I don't think my fundamental worldview has changed. I suppose I would probably be, you could press me and I might say that I'm maybe a little bit less optimistic than I used to be. I think that may be reflected a little bit in the books, but I don't think there's been a fundamental shift, in that I think the tenor of the books, I would hope, is still positive, because I don't think there's any point in our wallowing in misery. The world is a vale of tears. The world is a difficult place. There is great sorrow and suffering and deprivation in the world. All of that exists. And I think one shouldn't deny it. And I think in my books, I don't deny it. I mean, sometimes people say that I do, but I don't think that's quite fair. I think that it's there. So, for example, in the Botswana books, people said to me, oh, how can you write positive books about Africa? How can you write positive books when there's this awful HIV/AIDS crisis? Where's the HIV/AIDS crisis in your books? Now, I can see why they said that, because it would be like writing about London during the Blitz during the Second World War and not sort of saying that there were any bombs going off. So one has to actually be aware of what is happening in the world. But you can deal with it in a particular way. You don't deny it, you can just allude to it. And indeed, you can actually make a serious point about human suffering in a lighter way without putting it center stage. Because if you just focused on bleakness and suffering, human nastiness, confrontation, and so on, every novel would be a tragedy, and I don't think you'd get very, very, very far. So I think that would be my approach to that issue.
I'm glad you brought up the HIV/AIDS question, because I was watching the detective series, the television series based on the #1 Ladies Detective Agency, and they were very quick to sort of bring in Mama Kutsi's brother Richard, and they also made several changes in terms of characters. I mean, you spoke of Martin Curtin, who has an African heart, who's a white American but moves to Africa, and he became black for the series. So as somebody who feels strongly about your characters and settings, was it disconcerting when those editorial calls were made for television?
No, not really. I mean, they showed me the script. I'm sure that any writers present will understand the issues involved in having a film made of your work, because you realize that you're passing things over to a different creative team, so to speak, and obviously that's giving a bit of a hostage to fortune. I was shown the scripts, and generally speaking, I was happy with the scripts. There were one or two things that I raised with them, which I said, well, look, this wouldn't be said. This is culturally inappropriate. Somebody wouldn't have, because the scripts were written by people who didn't know the country. So I had to try and say that point. And sometimes they just sort of looked at me as if I was making odd points. And but generally speaking, they interpreted the novels, I think, in a sympathetic way. They also, Anthony Minghella, who was the director, in fact, the #1 Ladies Detective Agency was his last film before he died. He was a wonderful film director, and I had great confidence in him. I knew that he would handle it very carefully. He went to Botswana and he spent time with people. He got to know the culture, and they appreciated that his attempt to do that, and that comes across in the films, I think.
We spoke earlier about how the Botswana novels, how there's been an accusation, an unfair accusation, that they deal only with the positives. I was actually struck by this passage which deals with how the president was forced to leave. And I'm going to read out this passage about how everyone has a map of his own country in his heart. It seems to have a special resonance today, and I'll come to that. So this is what the passage says. Every man has a map in his heart of his own country, and the heart will never allow you to forget this map. If a man is born in a dry place, then although he may dream of rain, he does not want too much, and he will not mind the sun that beats down and down. These were the intimate memories that made the land alive, that bound people to a stretch of baked earth, as valuable to them and as beautiful as if it were covered with sweet grass. So we live in times when people are forced to leave their homes, flee terrorism, and then they come to other countries to the accusation that they may just be trying to, get better passports or whatever it is. So that must trouble you a lot.
Yes, I'm very interested in sense of place, And I'm very interested in the bond between people and the land. I think that that's something which is so universal and so strong and so important. And I think, obviously, we live in a world where that attachment to place is attenuated, weakened by all sorts of things. It's weakened by the fact that we can get up and leave the place that we've been born in and brought up in. We leave the bit of earth that we've had as our own, and we can be taken very quickly to something very, very different. And of course, people do this. So all of that is something which happens, and that, of course, can be positive in all sorts of respects. But what I find particularly interesting is the way in which the modern world can change so rapidly and can confuse us, even in relation to our familiar circumstances. There's a rather interesting word which was coined by an Australian psychologist and social psychologist, solastalgia, which sounds a little bit like nostalgia. It's an invented word, but he coined it to describe the feeling of sadness that people have when they see the world around them changing too quickly. The physical features of the world around them changing. So, for example, he studied a community in Australia where there'd been extensive strip mining, and so the hills changed, the topography changed, and people felt sad and confused. He studied an area where there'd been prolonged drought. Their gardens had died, the trees had died, the landscape around them was changing, and they have the sense of solastalgia, as he describes it, the sense of disruption, of loss, of what they've had around them. And I think that must happen also when people are unfortunately visited by natural disasters as well. They see the world around them being... And so all of these things are I suppose, weakening our sense of attachment to the land, weakening our sense of permanence. We know that we're on this world, on this earth, for a short time. Human life is short. We know that we're going to lose that which we consider dear, but we want at the same time to hold on to it, and we have to have that. We have to have that context to make our life meaningful. We want that. We want the same people. We want the same surroundings as far as possible. We want our culture, and we don't like to see that eroded, and we have to be anchored in the world. Mara Matsui in the books, she often says that, as in that quotation. She often will just go out and stand and look at what is around her, and she'll look up at the sky, or she'll look at the African bush, and she will just feel that this is her place. And I think to be rooted in that way is very important. And of course, the modern world is not really very sympathetic to that. I mean, look at the way we're obliged because of conditions to live at different levels in very tall buildings. We've lost a sense of where we are. Interestingly enough, in Scotland, in the 1960s, they cleared a lot of slums, which were 1 or 2 story buildings, obviously not very healthy, very damp and decrepit. And they created these big new skyscraper flats, 20 floors, and they said, this is the future. You're going to be happy now. We're taking you out of those houses and we're putting you in there. And people were miserable because they'd lost the sense of context, and they were in very anonymous, detached circumstances. So modern architecture, I'm very interested in architectural issues and planning issues, and I think the idea of great scale in housing developments and whatnot is asking for social trouble.
What you said about, a lot of what you said actually reminded me of this part in Emma where George Knightley is speaking to Mr. Woodhouse, and he speaks about the importance of remembering one's past and needing to apologize. And there's a lovely passage, if I could ask you to read this out. Yeah. And this is not the only time you speak of the importance of apologizing. Isabel Dalhousie brings it up. It comes up very frequently. It comes up with it comes up in the Corduroy Mansion series as well. But I think it's said more strongly and most clearly in this passage.
Yes, okay, this is from Emma, isn't it? The social consequences of it are still being felt in the West Indies. Ask them, they'll tell you that. We created a society in which family life was pretty much impossible. The society at the receiving end of that was irretrievably wounded, while we grew rich on the proceeds. Sugar fortunes came from all that, remember. And then the other person, I forget who's talking here, but the other person, Mr. Ware. But that's ages ago. It's got nothing to do with us. We still got the capital that we built up through slavery. It's still there. They lapsed into silence, as if both cowed by the sheer weight of post-imperial guilt. For a brief moment, Mr. Woodhouse closed his eyes and saw, rather vividly, an image of distant plantations, of Spanish ships sunk, of a viceroy riding an elephant in a durbar, of a lifeless tiger being carried upside down on a litter of bamboo poles. And he thought, if we can't find it within ourselves to apologize to the descendants of our victims, then our hands will remain forever dirty. Yes. I think that does raise very, very interesting issues about the tenacity of the past, and I suppose acknowledging the past in our ordinary scale of our human lives, but also at a much greater scale. I mean, one can't. It's a very complex issue, isn't it? Historical apology. You can't go through life apologizing all the time. We have to get on with life, and there's also a role for forgiveness. That's another theme that I have in my books, and it comes out, I think, in the Maramatsu books, is forgiveness and how important forgiveness is in healing. And you see that in certain circumstances. For example, in Northern Ireland, we had this endless situation of tit for tat, atrocity, conflict, etc. At some point, people had to break that cycle, and they had to say to people for whom they felt intense dislike, they had to actually find forgiveness. And that led to a much more peaceful society. Not perfect yet, but nonetheless. So those two things, acknowledgement of the role of the past, tempered with forgiveness and mercy, these are important things.
And I think that's a theme which finds its place in the Isabel Dalhousie novels as well, because the question of whether a crime is a crime if it isn't the intention of the person who has perpetrated it to commit a crime. So if there's an accidental crime. And the same thing goes with, I think, the telling the truth versus telling lies, telling hurtful truths versus telling harmless lies or good lies, as Mara Motswe says. And I was wondering if this moral debate, which a lot of your detectives and characters engage in, is that something which plays up in your life as a person who's involved with medical law and ethics?
Yes, I think that again, going back to what you said earlier on about the influence of the personal and the autobiographical element in books, you could certainly look at all my books and say, well, or many of my books, and say, well, those are issues that I suspect he's been concerned with in his past. So I was a professor of law. So I was very interested, and I wrote books on criminal law. I was very interested in the idea of human action, analysis of human action, and issues of responsibility, which of course are at the heart of criminal law. And so I think that's probably where those come from. They are constant themes. And I think that we have to be very careful that we don't become vindictive in our attitudes, our social attitudes. We live in quite a retributive age where people talk about responsibility, and accountability is a very important phrase. You are accountable. We're going to find the cause of our misfortunes, and we try to find somebody to blame for every misfortune that occurs. And that, of course, manifests itself in a society's tendency to be litigious. We want to blame people. But in fact, human action is much, and human life is much more complicated than that. and that what appears to be a situation that results from the fault of another may actually not be the result of individual fault, but may be the result of social fault, of many other causes. Most accidents don't have a single cause. They have a variety of causes. So, you take something like the Great Shuttle disaster. There were all sorts of causes which led to that decision to launch that space vehicle when the liquid oxygen or whatever it was leaking out of the seals. And it was systemic. It was a system which drove people. They were all sleep deprived. In fact, in a lot of accidents, that's something which I mention in the books from time to time, is sleep deprivation. A lot of human accidents and misfortunes are because people are half asleep when they're doing the things. And why are they asleep? It's not their fault. It's not their fault that that they feel sleepy. It's the fault of the system, which is driving them too hard.
Before the discussion gets too frivolous, I think we should turn to something really important, alcohol. A lot of your characters are fans of wine and whiskey, and I'd like to know if you're as fond of these beverages as your characters are.
This is the autobiographical. Well, no, I enjoy a glass of wine, but in moderation, I hasten to point out. And similarly, whiskey in moderation. Whiskey, you've got to be very moderate about. But they also drink a lot of tea. Let's not forget that.
Bush tea.
In fact, there's more tea drunk in my books than there's whiskey, definitely. In fact, people say to me in the Mara Mosby books, in the #1 Lady Detective Agency books, the characters often sit down and have a cup of tea, and they say this must be very symbolic. Tea must be performing some sort of symbolism there, and the answer is much more prosaic than that. The answer is that I can't think of anything to happen then, and so the characters just sit down and have a cup of tea, and then after they've had the tea, then we move on to the next thing. So tea is very useful, and in some of my books, coffee does the same thing. In the Corduroy Mansions books, coffee. So it's a very simple explanation, not a complex allusion, just a simple explanation.
But then no one wrote a lovely leaflet about tea or coffee as Mr. William French toys with on writing about wine. So if I could ask you to read this beautiful passage about how I think wine etiquette, the etiquette of buying wine. It's a beautiful passage, and you should hear it. This is from the Corduroy Mansion series, where William French.
That top bit there. How far shall I read? There's a long page.
I think the whole page. We have time for that. Yeah.
We have
you
that
should
warning
have the last.
saying there was a red sign which appeared saying 5 minutes only.
Can you read faster than you write?
No. Let's see. Let me take a read of this. This is about. Well, I'll do a little excerpt. He's talking about the etiquette of taking wine to other people. But of course he would go, and the real issue is whether you have to take a bottle of wine with you or not when you're invited to dinner. There's no strict ruling on this matter, as indeed on any issue of etiquette. What counts is attitude. The most terrible apparent breach of etiquette can be carried off by one who means well and is charming about it. But for most of us, charm will not suffice, in that we don't have enough of it, and we therefore need rules. Here are some. If you're a student and you're invited to a meal or party at another student's flat, there's absolutely no doubt that you must take a bottle of wine with you. If you do not do so, then the host is perfectly within his or her rights not to let you in. This is an absolute rule and cannot be avoided by saying that your friend, who's coming later, will be bringing a bottle for you. Most hosts have heard that line before and will not believe you. And so on. That business about taking presents when you're invited for dinner is very, very interesting. There's a general custom, and I don't know what the situation would be here in India, and maybe you can tell me about it, but certainly in Edinburgh, if you go to dinner, you often take a box of chocolates for your hostess. Now, that's interesting, because there is a box of chocolates in Edinburgh which has been circulating for over 8 years, and it's a box of after eights. And if you look at the date down at the bottom of the box it says best before 2002 or something like that. And that's quite interesting. Now that raises rather interesting issues about regifting. And I think I discussed that in one of the books about what you can do with unwanted presents. Can you give them away, or do you have to wait a while? Now, I take a view that we do need a firm rule. We need a firm social rule on this. So I think you have to wait for about a year in most cases before you can give presents away that you've received. And you've got to be very, very careful to remove the gift tag, because I did hear of one case where that wasn't done and people were able to trace the provenance of the, the gift. So it raises interesting issues. Etiquette issues are very interesting, aren't they?
Yeah, I think in India, I wouldn't be able to tell you about the after rates, but I'm sure at every wedding that you go to, there are about 500 tea sets and 200 pressure cookers. So I'm sure there are several antiques doing the rounds right now at weddings, and they're probably a lot more valuable than the gifters hope they will be.
Yes, pressure cookers are the things, are they? Yeah, I know. That's...
So I think we have time for one last question, and I want to turn this back to Madras and to R.K. Narayan, whom I know you've read, and he's someone whom we think of as our own, though he's not technically from Madras. And you said in an interview that you wouldn't have been able to write the Botswana novels had you not read him. So what is it about him that you've taken away into those novels? Is it the sense of place or his characters? Or?
Well, yes. I mean, I have the greatest feeling for R.K. Narayan, who's one of my absolute favorite writers. I did the introduction to the American republication of Narayan's works when they brought out 6 or 7 of the novels in composite form in the US, and I was very honored to be able to write the preface to those. I think that he was, his writing, I think the single quality which I would identify, which meant so much to me and which I think really makes him such a great writer, is a beautiful simplicity. That he tells a story in a beautiful way. There's no stumbling over stylistic show or anything of that sort. It's just a lovely, lovely narrative and a peaceful narrative and a sympathetic narrative. That this is, you can see this is a novelist of great sympathy and understanding. And it's because he's dealing with simple situations, with people's day-to-day lives. There's nothing really spectacular happening in the books. It's ordinary ambitions, ordinary existence, ordinary hopes. That's what makes them universal. His novels have a quality of universality, which is quite exceptional. Why I said that I couldn't have written the #1 Ladies Detective Agency, I might not have written had I not read Narayan, would be because I think they're such vivid accounts of life in a small place, so to speak. I mean, it's not necessarily a small town, but it's that sort of thing, and that affected my approach to telling the Botswana stories. I mean, I just regard him as the sort of writer that I would want to be, in a sense, and that's it's as straightforward as that. And I think it's a very great pity that he isn't more appreciated outside India. I mean, people know about him and he's still in print, but I think these are great, enduring classics. I love them. And you can see, I think, if you read my Botswana books, you can see the influence, I think. I'm sure you can see the influence.
How much time do we have for questions? It's a wrap? Okay. Maybe we can, yeah, well, I can see someone waving hands very, so maybe we can take 2 questions. But first, let me do a poll. How many people want Mr. McCall Smith's advice on how to write the next best-selling detective novel, the #2 Ladies Detective Agency novels? Nobody. And how many of you have recommendations as to where he should set his next series? India. India.
Well, I wouldn't dare to write. I mean, you've got to really know the place you write about, I think.
So there's a question from the lady here.
I would say he should do a book on England. You know, as a Scotsman doing a book on England, I think the character right now would be quite interesting, if I may. Just to say a bit of reflection, I think both the questioner and the novelist, you know, a lot of humor you started off, and it got a bit serious in between. Blissfully brought it back. The laughter was again there. My question from that, drawn from that, do you see this world as you've been writing? It was grim, nasty, but there was a lot of fun too. But it has now become just grim, nasty, and retributional. The word that you used, the world. How do you see it?
I had difficulty hearing how I see the world.
Is it a grim? Is that your question? Do you see the world as grim and nasty?
You know, from the conversation, it made me think it is grim, nasty, but funny too.
Yes.
But now, as it became quite serious. Then I thought the world is a world that you're seeing is grim, nasty, and retributional. Now.
Yes, I don't think, no, thank you for the question. I don't see the world as exclusively that. I see that there are grim aspects to our contemporary world, and I think they're quite significant. But I wouldn't say that those are the sole features, and I would say that one can transcend those, one can get over those features and still take an optimistic view of humanity. So I don't see the world as irredeemably grim and nasty.
And there's a young lady here with the mic.
So the number one ladies detective agency books are written with a more female perspective. Where do you get the insight?
Very good question. Thank you for that. Very, very good question. Where do I get the insight? Because it's from a female perspective. And I suppose just by, well, my household consists entirely of women. And it's only me and the cat who are male. So there's that. But the answer to your question is by listening to people and realizing what people are about by listening to them. I think that's the way to develop another perspective. That was a jolly good question. Thank you.
And one last question from Preetham.
Thank you. And jolly good answer too. The difference between Number One Ladies Club and Isabella Dalhousie, on the other hand, is the first one is very externalized. I mean, every thought, every feeling is externalized, whereas Dalhousie is more internalized. And does that come from the culture or the landscape? When I read a Dalhousie, I can almost hear the wind of Edinburgh, and here it's more chatter. And a buzz.
Yes, thank you for that. That's a very, very interesting question. Thank you for that. I think the difference really is between the approach, the philosophical approach of Mara Matsui and Isabel Dalhousie, in that Isabel Dalhousie is a trained philosopher. She's a professional philosopher, and she therefore approaches matters in a rather different way. She's, as you say, there's a lot of internalization, there's a lot of debate with herself. And I think that just comes not so much from the culture as from the individual's approach. She is as a professional philosopher. Whereas Mara Matsui is more, how would one put it, intuitive. I think she's a much more intuitive person. Now, the interesting thing is that Mara Matsui usually gets it right. Isabel Dalhousie often gets it wrong. And so there's a bit of a comment there on the difference between intuitive reasoning and intuitive response to things and a very rigid, well, not necessarily rigid, but a very intellectualized approach. So Mara Matsui, in a sense, wins with her intuition as opposed to her philosophical wrestling with herself.
Thank you so much, Mr. McCall Smith, for taking the time out. And